Early in January of this year, I accompanied my grandfather down to eastern Tennessee to the small rural town that he grew up in. After Hurricane Helene, my grandfather wanted to see how his childhood home, about a 20-minute drive east of the town, had fared during the devastating weather. While on this trip, however, my grandfather shared with me a lot of stories about his childhood, growing up in Appalachia, and a lot of other things. I learned a lot about him that I simply had never known. One story in particular, however, was genuinely scary, and I had trouble sleeping the night after hearing it. I still occasionally have weird nightmares about it. I'll recount the story below. In February of 1954, a few weeks before my grandfather turned 12, his family's little farm had been experiencing some attacks on their animals, mainly the chickens. In the weeks before, they had lost about 7 or 8 chickens from their flock of 30 or so. They had a small property, an acre or two in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically near a place called Hall Mountain. And one night, during a fairly heavy snowstorm, my grandfather's family was awoken to the sounds of chickens screaming and flocking around in their coop some 70 or so yards away from the house. My grandfather and his dad, Paul, immediately jumped into the boots and coats and ran outside to confront what they believed would be some coyotes. As they ran outside the back door, my great-grandfather with his rifle and my grandfather with a pellet gun both stopped dead in their tracks as they saw what my grandfather described as the nastiest, most foul-looking human-type creature that you could imagine. A light on the barn illuminated the creature, and my grandfather said that it was almost completely naked, save for what looked to be a bear pelt draped around its shoulders, with a dead chicken in its mouth. Paul snapped out of his shock and fired a few rounds at the creature. He nicked it once in the upper thigh as it ran across the field, initially on 2 legs, before it then dropped down to all 4s and disappeared into the woods. My grandfather and his father stood there in shock. They made sure the rest of the chickens and the other animals were all right before my grandfather was told to go back inside. He checked on his mom and his sister, and he went back to bed, Paul staying outside for a few hours, pacing back and forth on the porch, just waiting for that creature to come back. My grandfather said he hardly slept the rest of that night, and when he got up the next morning, he saw his father in the living room on their phone. As he was eating breakfast, his father came into the dining room, whispered something to his wife, and sat at the table. When my grandfather finished eating breakfast, his mother left the room and his father cleared his throat, and he started talking. "I was, on the phone with your uncle. He'll be here this afternoon with your cousin. We're gonna follow that blood trail that was left behind by whatever that creature was we saw last night. It went down into the holler on the mountain," my grandfather said as he just shook his head quietly and didn't speak the rest of the morning. By 12:30, he, his father, his uncle Peter, and his cousin Samuel were all walking northwest into the woods, following the bloody trail left behind the previous night. My grandfather said it felt like an hour or so must have passed before anyone spoke. His uncle Peter, who was much more of a hunter than Paul, stopped everyone and pointed at something slightly up the trail. The tracks led up to a spot in the snow that was just soaked in blood. My grandfather said it looked like something had just keeled over and died. What shocked them as they approached it, however, was how it appeared like whatever had laid there had been dragged deeper into the woods. They began following the new trail that had been dragged through the snow, and began noticing multiple sets of tracks which were made by bare human feet, all alongside the dragged trail. It was at this moment when my grandfather noticed his father switching the safety on his rifle to off. They trekked alongside the trail a little farther until they reached a small frozen stream. On the other side of the stream, tucked under a massive cliff overhang, was a cave entrance. My grandfather said it was about 20 feet across, and maybe 6.5 feet tall at its tallest. The bloody drag marks and the multiple tracks led right across the stream and into the cave. Paul and Peter told the boys to wait behind a rock, and if they didn't shout back that they were okay in 5 minutes, to go run back home and call the police. They walked over the river and stood at the cave entrance before shining a light into it, and slowly, They walked in. My grandfather said that about 4 minutes passed before they heard his uncle's voice, but that it felt like an eternity before they saw his Uncle Peter come out, and his father shortly followed. My grandfather said that they were both pale as ghosts, and that they hardly spoke on the long hike back. My grandfather and Samuel begged Paul and Peter to tell them what they saw, but the two men wouldn't budge, just saying they would all talk later. They returned to my grandfather's house around 3 o'clock that afternoon, and Uncle Peter and Samuel immediately got in their truck and left without saying a word. My grandfather and his father walked in through the back door into the kitchen, where his mother was waiting anxiously. Paul hugged her and whispered something to her. She nodded and went into a separate room. Paul sat down at a desk in the kitchen and motioned for my grandfather to bring a chair over and to sit down. My grandfather did so, and this is what Paul told him, apparently verbatim. "Your uncle and I went into that cave and we saw people. They aren't people like you or me or anyone you know. They're very different. They live deep in the woods and they don't leave, hardly ever. They're almost like animals, I suppose. You might call them wild. It seems like they've lived deep in those woods and hollers longer than anyone has ever been here. We saw the person I shot last night, and he must have died because his people were giving him a burial, I believe. They saw us, and they acknowledged us. They didn't seem mad, but I knew we weren't welcome back there. Tommy, do not ever go across that creek. Everything over it is theirs, and we'll lead them to it." My grandfather said that that was the only time his father ever spoke of what he saw in that cave. His father never went back, and neither did he. I know the whole feral people concept is up in the air, and most people don't believe it, which I completely understand. Honestly, I don't think I do either. But the way my grandfather spoke about it, the sincerity with which he spoke, and the tone of his voice during certain parts of the story, I fully believe he was being honest. He truly saw his father fatally shoot a feral human, and his father and his uncle truly saw a small feral community living in a cave deep in the Appalachian Hills. So, I grew up in a very small town next to the Mexico border in America. My family had taught me about being cautious of human traffickers or drug traffickers in our area because of recent incidences. Not quite sure if that's important to the story, but it helped with how I acted. My best friend and I, who were both 14 at the time and in high school, decided to take a walk in a nearby park. It was a very popular park, and it was within walking distance from both of our houses, so off we went. As we were walking around and talking, a grown man in about his 40s came up to us. He said he was new in town and didn't know where anything was or how to get there. My friend and I gave each other a look of slight nervousness, but kept our cool. We didn't engage him much in the conversation, but we started to feel more and more uncomfortable as the conversation went on. He asked if we went to the local middle school that was down the street, and I said that we were high schoolers, but didn't mention which one. It already bothered me that a grown man wanted to talk to who he thought was middle school kids. Then I noticed something and gave my friend a signal with my eyes. There was another man behind us, also following us. I wouldn't have even noticed him if the guy talking to us hadn't smiled at the guy when I confirmed that we were underage. This man kept his head down every time I looked back and wore a hat that was hiding his face. As we walked around the park, the first guy kept asking questions, and the second guy didn't stray too far, and didn't even try to act as though he wasn't following us. This was getting too much for me. The first man's questions were either about our small town, or about our lives in the town. Nothing too invasive, until we asked for our phone numbers. This was almost 10 years ago, and even though smartphones were a thing, I had a flip phone. We were broke teens. My friend claimed she didn't have a phone. I can't remember if this was true or not, but I do remember knowing I couldn't pull the same sentence due to being on my phone fiddling with it. It's a flip phone, so there isn't much to do on it in the first place. So I just admitted that I'd rather not give out my number. He started telling me things like, "Aw, come on, why not? You girls can show me around town." Things like that. I just explained I had limited texts and minutes, and so I don't give out my number easily. This is when I noticed how dark it was getting outside. His questions kept us stuck in the park till dark because we were too scared to try to walk home. And it was a fairly populated park, so if things got worse, there were other people out there that we could run to. These guys were much bigger than us, and we didn't see anyone that we knew that we could run to. I just had to bite the bullet. I told him it was getting too dark and we had to start heading home, and then directed my friend towards the edge of the park to our houses. But that didn't stop him. He followed after, saying he could drive us home, and that we wouldn't have to walk. I lied and claimed it was just down the block. It was actually about 5 very long blocks away. He claimed he, quote-unquote, wouldn't feel right just letting 2 young girls walk home alone. And then he pointed at a nearby parking lot saying, "Look, my car's not too far. Let me just drive you home." At this moment, I noticed a second man following us was now suddenly only 2 or 3 steps behind us, instead of the distance that he was originally at. Nope, not dealing with this. I said it was faster if we just walked, and then quickly said bye, nice to meet you, and we sped off. My mom always taught me to be polite, and looking back, I wish she hadn't. Ladies, don't be polite to men that creep you out. I was too young, but if this happened now, I wouldn't have been so polite. My friend and I sped and walked across the street, only to see both men hurry to the parking lot. I didn't think much about them hurrying away. Maybe they were running to get out of there since we were leaving. I started to feel this rush of relief, knowing that they weren't following us anymore. And that relief, however, was short-lived. We were on the left side of the road, and while walking, we noticed a van turn onto the street on the right side of the road. It, of course, was them. They were obviously on the opposite side of the road, but they were hardcore staring at us as they drove by, only to do a sharp turn at the end of the block. Feeling a bit wary, we decided to cross the street just in case. They came right back to the road, and luckily this time we were on the right side of the street, and they were on the left side. Thankfully, these streets were pretty big, so they couldn't just drive on the opposite side. More stares as they drove past, only to do another sharp turn at the end of the block. There was nothing for us to do in the middle of this long block, except to hide and hope for the best. We ducked behind a car parked in someone's driveway, and we waited. An old lady spotted us and seemed suspicious, but didn't say a word. She watched the street as well, and there went by the same van. We couldn't see them at our angle, but I knew it was the van. The van this time drove by much, much slower. We felt like it was taking forever for them to clear out the block. "They left. You should be good," said the old lady. We thank her, and then we run towards where we lived. She lived closer than me, so after I made sure she was home, I then ran all the way to my house non-stop. I kept my eye on the street for vans, but they either lost us or gave up. I still have never been more scared than that night, running 2 blocks home at night by myself. This happened around 2018. For context, a buddy of mine, we'll call him KG, used to be our group's ladies' man, and it wasn't uncommon for him to want to go meet up with somebody during the night. This night in particular was no different. Some girl messaged him on a dating app inviting him to come hang out. He said he was with a friend but would be free in a few hours. She said no problem, just bring him. We can all smoke and just hang out. I was fine with it, and she gave KG the address. The place was an apartment about an hour away, and so we got in the truck and headed over. Before I get further into this story, I would like to emphasize that this does go into discussion of drugging and attempted sexual assault. So, if that's uncomfortable, feel free to skip ahead. I don't blame you. The drive was 30 minutes down the highway, followed by 45 minutes of nothing but gravel roads and fields. I distinctly remember we joked about how it felt like we were in an alternate dimension. Zero lights, no houses, and I don't remember seeing a speed limit or a stop sign for most of the drive. Once we arrived, it was extremely ominous. A single yellow light hung over a single apartment building that, probably, only had about 3 units. The place looked old and borderline abandoned. The girl, who I'll call M, was standing out there waiting for us. I couldn't make out any features, as all I saw from the car was a silhouette. We got out, and she let us inside. KG seemed uncomfortable when he saw her, but was playing it off. I noticed that she was considerably older than us, and was not the type that KG would normally go for. To be entirely honest, she looked cracked out. Her face was covered in the marks that you see when stimulant users obsessively pick their faces. Regardless, we get into her apartment, and shit was off immediately. The place was bare. A single couch lined with plastic, and a TV sat in the living room, and the kitchen cabinets were all empty, and many were just open. For some reason, I also remember Bob's Burgers playing at an ungodly volume on the TV. She had a couple of blunts already rolled up, and I got to breaking down our share to roll. She offered us a cup of white box wine, and said it was all she had. She poured 3 glasses, and I knocked back about half of it, before almost gagging at the chemical taste. I didn't say anything. I don't like wine as it is, and I only accepted it because I was thirsty. And she said her tap water wasn't safe to drink. I figured it was just really cheap, and I didn't want to be rude. KG drank his, and we got to smoking and talking. Once she got up to go to the bathroom, KG whispered to me that he got catfished, and showed me the profile with a different girl's photos. I asked if we should go, and he said she was probably just insecure, and that he still wants to hang out and see where things go. She got back and insisted on another blunt, specifically the one that she rolled. We kept talking, and I noticed she seemed to be getting antsy and shorter in her responses. Kept being very flirtatious with the both of us, saying we would be a lot more comfy if we went in her room. I also noticed I was beginning to feel strange. Not the fun strangeness of THC, but the ominous feeling that I was losing control of my muscles and having a hard time thinking or talking. KG was melted on the couch, but still carrying on talking to her. I looked in my glass and noticed powdery gunk collecting at the top. I felt sick and stumbled to the bathroom, and the bathroom was disgusting. I sat down on the side of the tub and tried to figure out what the hell was happening. I was convinced we'd been drugged, but I kept telling myself I was just greening out and being paranoid, despite that not being normal for me. I eventually lost track of time and place in there, and luckily I was smart enough to lock the door. At some point, I walked out to see the living room empty and heard groaning in the other room. I knocked on the door, and I got no answer. I blacked out on the couch again, and only came to after hearing shuffling and seeing KG bust out of the room half naked, and M following him. I stood up, and she looked stone-faced. KG didn't say anything and stumbled fast out the door. I didn't need to be convinced, and I followed quickly. The entire walk back to the car, she followed us. Not running or yelling, just walking with us, seemingly waiting for us to fall. Somehow, in his drugged-up state, KG got the car going, and we peeled off. I don't remember much after that, but we both woke up the next afternoon parked at a church in the middle of nowhere. Both of us had pounding headaches, and KG said that, after I went into the bathroom, she pulled him up and helped him into the bedroom, whispering how we were hers forever, and that we never had to worry about anything ever again. He knew this was bad, but in his haze, he couldn't stand or yell for me. We drove home silently, and I didn't see KG for a while after that. And when I did, we never spoke of it again. More of the story: just because you aren't alone doesn't mean you are safe. Just because you're a man doesn't mean you're safe. If you feel something is off, don't wait to get out of there. And for the love of God, don't drink anything you didn't see poured. Sorry if this story is a bit of a downer or if it's inappropriate. The memory has just never left my mind. It was awful and terrifying, but also surreal, and it almost felt like a dream. KG said that luckily I knocked at the perfect time, and she didn't get what she wanted out of him, and the knock brought him back to momentary awareness. Things could have been a lot worse, but I'll never forget what happened in the apartment in those fields. It's 2014. After 2 years of stagnation, I decided to do something with my life, and despite my parents' opinion, I moved out. I also decided to continue my education, but to do so without help, I had to start 2 jobs. That's how I ended up in the basement with my roommate, Ryan, a fake name. The whole house belonged to his parents and had 2 floors and a basement. The second floor was occupied by an older couple, the first by a woman whom I saw twice during the whole stay, and the ground floor was empty. Honestly, living there was awful. Even without the older couple fighting, our ceiling was constantly leaking, and the windows were in a place where people could access them. What the fuck? Even without the older couple fighting, our ceiling was constantly leaking, and the windows were in a place where people could access... Fuck, I did it again. And the windows were in a place where people could access them from the street. They would often stare at what we were doing. We had drunk people peeing on our windows, or kids trying to take something off the windowsill, or get in. Summer was a nightmare. But after 2 or 3 months, I was so tired that I stopped caring. Do you want to watch me undress in my room? Fine. Another colony of spiders in our bathroom? Well, I guess my arachnophobia is cured. Time for a bath. Ryan taking my stuff without asking? Who cares? 2 years later, it's 2014. It's August and I'm sleep deprived. But I finally have a week off. No studies, no work, no responsibilities. Just some good rest. So I lie in bed and sleep all day. But around 4 p.m., I start hearing sounds. Lots of shuffling, slamming doors, and quick footsteps. Before I was fully awake, the door to my room opened. Someone grabbed me and started shaking me, saying, "Get up." Okay. I opened my eyes. My first and only thought, Ryan. But this man looked nothing like him. Ryan had long black hair and was very thin, and he always wore a green hoodie. This man was much taller, more muscular, and bald. But yeah, my brain saw all those differences and still thought, Ryan? I even remember saying, "What? Can't you see I'm trying to rest?" And then I turned on my left side. But Ryan didn't leave though. He tugged at me again, still saying, "Get up." I said, "No way." And then, "I don't care what you did this time, get out." Though it was probably a lot less coherent and understandable. Welp, quote-unquote, Ryan left, and I heard him moving around our house for a while and making noise. Then, I fell asleep. 2 hours later, Ryan wakes me up again. He's panicked and asks if I'm fine. I'm just like, "What? No." Our kitchen and Ryan's room were destroyed. We also lost our laptops, my phone, Ryan's games and manga, some food from the fridge, and, for some reason, my notebooks and a cheap small Bulbasaur figurine that I kept on my night table. After this, police quickly arrived and, thanks to the neighbors and their cameras, we had footage of a tall, bald man entering our property after 3 p.m., spending a while hanging around the front, and then going to the back. The police were not happy to hear my part of the story. They looked at me as if they were wondering how I managed to survive so many years. Ryan's parents were even less impressed. They spent days complaining about me and making up a story about how I should have fought and protected the house. My parents tried again to convince me to move back, and after 3 weeks, the situation only became more irritating, so I packed my bags, and I did it. After that, I had a few conversations with the police, but as far as I know, the burglar was never found. This happened back in October, but I haven't been on Reddit for a while, and after logging in, I stumbled across this sub and realized I finally have something to add. I wish I didn't though. This is the most in danger I've ever felt in my life. Let me start with context. I'm a female, 19, and I work at a typical photo studio that's placed within a retail store. Not gonna name which one, but your first guess is probably correct. On this particular day, I was scheduled to work 3 to 7, which was our closing hours. Unless there's an oversaturation of appointments at a particular time, it's usually only one employee working at a time. It's in the basement of the 2-floor retail store tucked away in a little back corner. On this particular day, I came in to close the studio and relieve my coworker and manager as they got off at 3:30. I clocked in at our computers and started chatting with my boss about where we were. There was one family in the camera room, and they were running a little behind. She told me about my assigned family, and also encouraged me to get what's called a pull-in. Basically, we try to get customers from the retail store to come take photos in whatever they're in exchange for 2 free photos fully shipped and covered. There was a man wearing a prison-looking uniform. Definitely didn't look real. It looked like a costume. It was October, so it wasn't crazy that he was wearing a costume. It wasn't Halloween weekend or Halloween day, which I thought was a bit weird since he didn't have an appointment, and was standing around the practically barren areas of the retail store, next to the studio. He was just wandering. I don't think my boss got a good look at how he was acting yet because she asked him if he wanted to come in for some photos. She said something about how he already had the costume and it would be perfect. I didn't hear much of this because I was checking in with the next family. My boss walked by me as I was about to head in to set up the studio and let me know that the guy was interested in photos after this appointment. The family I was working with was great and things went smoothly, but I noticed during the session that he had come sit on the bench closest to the photo studio. No big deal, but this bench is usually used for parents to watch or put their belongings on, but it's not like he was expected to know that. My boss popped into the photo room one last time before she left and told me something along the lines of, "Hey, I'm getting some weird vibes from that guy you're gonna photograph, so I'm gonna have Andrew, our retail store manager, and also a fake name, come by and check in and make sure that everything's going alright. After taking the photos, it takes me a few minutes to edit them. The customer goes out, and I stay in the camera room, just editing." The family went and sat down at a different bench, and at this point, the guy started walking into the studio and asking when it was his turn. It was at this point I noticed his crowbar, and that it was fully real and not a prop. It started to make me nervous the way he was just swinging it around. I told him I would be able to help him in a minute and to go wait outside. While he's outside, he starts sitting down on the bench and folding over on himself, just nodding off, snapping back up and moving around. I'm not stupid. I knew he was on drugs, and it was just me, him, a single mom, and her 2 children. I stopped paying attention to my editing and started paying attention to him, and I could tell he was starting to make this family uncomfortable. He started waving around the crowbar in dangerous ways, and I was concerned about the glass and my safety. He walked back into the studio a few times and wasn't taking no for an answer, continually barging into the studio and asking, "When are you gonna take my picture?" with this horrifying dead look. I finally got done editing the family's photos and I was practically shaking at the checkout. The mom I was working with tuned into the situation pretty quickly. The guy kept looking over the computer, trying to see her photos. She loudly asked, "Can I help you?" To which the guy just responded, rambling about how he was supposed to be taking pictures. She whispered over to me, but I was sure he could still hear, and she asked me if I was okay. I took out their appointment paper and said out loud something about the price, and then I wrote on the paper that he wasn't going away, and that my manager was supposed to be on the way to help. At this point, it had been about an hour and a half since my coworkers left. She seemed still on edge, but we went through her transaction. At this point, I felt completely paralyzed. I was one card swipe away from being alone in this tiny studio, all with this crazy, drugged-out man with a real metal crowbar. Why did I say it like that? With a real metal crowbar. I went to scan her card on our in-studio card scanning machine, and by the grace of God, her card wasn't working. If the card won't scan on the local system, we have to reprint the transaction and check out at a regular register inside the retail store. I saw this moment as my out. I grabbed the newly printed paper and walked her over to the registers at her salon. The second I was out of the man's eyesight, I burst into tears explaining what happened to one of the salon guys. He immediately pages the manager over our phone, and they ask me if I would like to wait in the break room or the salon. I would have had to walk past this man to go to the break room, so I just stayed put in the salon. The mom who was helping me throughout this whole experience told me afterwards that there was no way she was going to leave me alone with him, no matter what. And that was reassuring to hear. I had to wait it out for them to kick him out. The manager got another guy, and they both went to confront him. After about 15 minutes, I peeked to see if the guy had left the studio yet, and he was gone. Thank God I didn't have any other appointments that night, but I still had to sit alone in that studio the rest of the night, and every time the elevator went off, it startled me a bit. It took a while to recover from, and I still get uneasy working alone sometimes. I think the scariest part of all is what I didn't see. About 45 minutes later, the manager of the store came by and checked in on me. I asked him about the guy and how kicking him out went. He proceeded to tell me that this man became furious, causing a complete scene. He threw his crowbar to the ground near the manager, and after getting mall security over to help, they were successfully able to escort him out. I was supposed to wait outside for an Uber after work, but I decided to wait in the studio, and I got a ride home from my mom. I figured I'd post this here to get some outside thoughts after I've terrified my wife. I want to preface this by saying that I have hunted and hiked in the region since I was 9 years old. I'm very familiar with the wildlife and the sounds of the forest. I'm not a believer in any of this sort of thing, but I don't have an explanation for what happened tonight. I hiked about 1.5 miles through forest and swamp, hunting deer today. I got to the pocket of woods and field that I wanted to be in, and I found a tree that I could climb in and hunt out of. By all accounts, this was an uneventful afternoon and evening until sundown. For about 30 straight minutes, I listened to a rabbit being tortured and just wouldn't stop screaming. If you've heard a dog or a hawk get a rabbit or hunted rabbits, you know what I'm talking about. When they are distressed, they scream bloody murder, and this just seemed to continue on forever. Naturally, this can make you on edge, but I figured a hawk got it and just wasn't killing it. Then the sound of a twig snapping and silence. The rabbit stopped. Through the thicket, I could make out a figure, vaguely deer-shaped, moving through the woods about 35 yards away. So I grabbed my bow, but the undergrowth was far too thick for me to pick out much more than a rough outline. It walked behind a tree and disappeared. The sun is now fully set, and I'm in the last 15 minutes of post-sundown light. And I hear in a flat, emotionless child's voice coming from where that quote-unquote deer disappeared. Help, help, help. No fluctuation or distress to the voice. Not said as if it was asking for help, just a statement. Help, help, help. It said that probably 15 times. And then the woods went silent. There wasn't even a breeze to make a sound. Then, a crack of a limb of a tree snapping, and all hell broke loose in the woods. Squirrels, birds, and deer suddenly shot out of the woods like bats out of hell, sounding like an absolute stampede through the forest. And then, silence again. To make things worse for me, I lost my hat-clipped light on my walk-in, and I had to haul ass 1.5 miles through the woods, back to my truck in only darkness, my path only lit by the night's full moon. Update. I went back to the woods this morning. Last night after getting back to my truck, I called a few friends to let them know what happened, and then I had a relatively sleepless night. This morning I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I decided that I needed to return. I grabbed my hunting dog, called up a buddy to come with, and set out back to those woods. First, I drove around the property. Nobody was parked at any trailhead, so there shouldn't be anyone around. We took a long way around, heading north to get to the woods. A few miles from the parking area, we stopped to talk, look for animal signs, and listen as we went. We approached the woods from the south, keeping on the outside of it, in a tall, grassy, wet field. As we approached within 200 or so yards of where I heard that thing last night, we stopped to talk for a moment and plan how to best go about entering the woods. This isn't some manicured forest that's easy walking. The undergrowth is dense and filled with thorny shrubs and buckthorn. Whereas yesterday and in weeks past, this area was teeming with life. Deer, pheasants, hundreds of turkeys and their poults, crows, squirrels, and rabbits. And today, these woods and fields were completely silent. As we discussed this, I realized my dog was nowhere to be seen or heard. She normally wears a bell, or the metal pieces of her collar are sufficient for me to hear wherever she's at, but it's silent. She wears an e-collar that I can press a button, and it'll make a beeping noise that I can hear. I press that button, and silence. I yell for her, and silence. Then, coming from the forest ahead of me, I hear the yelping of my dog in pain. Loud and clearly my dog. I look at my friend and take off towards the woods, calling and beeping the collar, calling out and beeping the collar again, and waiting, and it just goes back to silence. I look at my buddy and he asks, "What are you doing?" As if he hadn't heard it. We stop and wait for a moment on the edge of the woods. I call one more time, and finally hear the jingle of her collar coming up to me, completely unharmed from the opposite direction of where I thought I heard her crying. Confused, we distanced ourselves from the woods again and continued north along the edge. Again, we neither heard nor saw any wildlife. We found a few spots where things were recently killed, staining the ground with rotted blood, but no signs of anything living. Eventually, we turned back, and as we crossed the same spot I thought I heard my dog, my friend stops. He looks at me in a panic and says, "Oh shit, your dog!" And he takes off running into the woods. I called after him asking what he was doing, and he just said he heard her crying in pain in the woods, and was as confused when I said I heard nothing. Just the same as when we first walked by and I was the one who heard it. I could see my dog in the opposite direction smelling around, totally unharmed. I called to my friend that the dog was fine and was over by me, and we rushed out. For those that might ask what else it may be, I have heard my dog yelping before, and that was it. It doesn't sound anything like coyotes or wolves. I won't be returning to that area again.